Everyone heard the sound. It cracked across the neighborhood like thunder splitting the sky. A single shot, sharp, violent, echoing off the vinyl siding of cookie-cutter homes that were supposed to represent peace. The silence that followed was heavier than the bullet itself. Mothers pulled their children indoors, dogs stopped barking, and on the front lawn of a quiet house, a boy stumbled backward, his hands shaking, his shirt darkening where the round had grazed his side. He was only 16. No one expected it would come from her. Not the woman who hosted luncheons in the HOA clubhouse. Not the smiling neighbor who had once passed out cookies at Christmas. But behind the manicured hedges and the power she clung to, Karen had been seething. And that afternoon, her anger crossed into something unthinkable. The boy's father was there when it happened. He had been gone for the week work had taken him across the state. His wife had begged him to be careful, had kissed him at the door, never imagining danger would find their family before he returned. But fate has a way of testing those who least deserve it. And when the phone rang that night, when he heard his wife's trembling voice, he felt a kind of silence inside his chest that only a soldier knows. She whispered through sobs, "They fired at our son." The world stopped moving. For years, he had thought he'd left violence behind. He had folded away uniforms, medals, and photographs in a cedar chest in the attic. He had promised himself that his new battles would be with bills and broken sprinklers, not with rifles or targets. He thought peace had been earned, but the war had followed him home. And this time, it wore the face of a neighbor who believed the HOA gave her the right to play God over families. But here's the thing no one in that cul-de-sac knew. This father wasn't just another man behind a picket fence. Long before mortgages and mailbox keys, he had been the one called when lives hung in the balance. He was a sniper, one of the best, patient, invisible, precise. He had spent years training his eye, steadying his breathing, and waiting for the perfect moment. He had protected lives from rooftops, from deserts, from shadows no one else could see. And now the weapon wasn't in his hands, it was in hers. What made her snap that day? Was it pride, spite, or simply a delusion that power over lawns extended to power over lives? The truth would unravel slowly, painfully. But the first glimpse came when neighbors whispered that Karen had been arguing with the boy, something about a bike left near the sidewalk. Something so small, so trivial, it could never justify what came next. But sometimes, the cracks in a person's heart show themselves in the pettiest of battles. The boy survived, but the scar on his side wasn't just flesh. It was the mark of betrayal, the reminder that home wasn't safe anymore. His mother held him all night, rocking him like she had when he was a child, her tears soaking into his hair. And when she looked out the window, when she saw Karen's porch light burning across the street as if nothing had happened, her grief hardened into something sharper: resolve. Because you don't fire at a child without consequences. The next morning, the father drove back, his truck cutting through miles of empty highway, the sun just beginning to rise. He didn't play music, he didn't make calls. He drove in silence, each mile a countdown, each turn of the wheel a reminder of what waited for him at home. People talk about adrenaline, about how it makes the heart race and the mind sharpen. But this was different. This was something colder, deeper. A soldier's calm before the storm. Neighbors peeked through curtains when his truck pulled in. They had heard the whispers, they had seen the flashing lights the night before. They wondered what a father would do when his son had been targeted. But none of them could imagine that the man stepping out of the truck carried with him not just grief, not just fury, but a skill set honed for moments exactly like this. And as he walked through his front door, his son's pale face greeting him with a weak smile, he made a silent promise. This fight wasn't over. Because sometimes, the most dangerous person isn't the one who pulls the trigger. It's the one who knows exactly what to do when the smoke clears. The boy's father didn't sleep that first night back. He sat in the living room, a lamp dimly glowing beside him, the sound of his son's uneven breathing drifting from down the hall. His wife had begged him to rest, but he couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it, Karen's finger curling around a trigger, the crack of the shot, his boy staggering in pain. Some neighbors said it was an accident, others whispered it was intentional, but the truth was hidden beneath layers of silence and fear. The HOA board didn't want scandal. They wanted order, control, and the appearance of perfection. They urged everyone to let the police handle it, but the father knew better. He had spent a lifetime watching powerful people sweep truth under polished floors. And this time the truth was bleeding in his own family. When the sun rose, he stood in the kitchen, hands braced against the counter, staring out the window at Corinne's house. Her curtains were drawn, her porch quiet, but he could feel the weight of her presence. She wasn't hiding. She was calculating, and that made her dangerous. His wife joined him, wrapping her robe tighter around her shoulders. Her voice cracked when she asked, "What are we supposed to do now?" He turned to her slowly, his expression carved from stone. "We protect him, whatever it takes." But deep down, he knew protection wasn't enough. Not this time. The war had already crossed the property line. The boy, lying in bed, tried to act stronger than he felt. He insisted it was just a graze, insisted he didn't need fussing over. But his eyes told the truth, fear lingering in the corners, shame that he hadn't seen it coming, anger that someone could strip him of his sense of safety in his own front yard. His father knelt beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder, whispering words that weren't just comfort. They were a vow. "You did nothing wrong. This is not your burden to carry." But even as he said it, he felt the weight shifting onto his own shoulders. By mid-morning, squad cars had come and gone, officers had scribbled notes, taped off sections of the yard. But everyone in the neighborhood knew what was really happening. Corinne was already bending the narrative. She claimed it was a warning shot, claimed she never intended to hit anyone. She told officers she was afraid for her safety, spinning a story that turned her into the victim. And because the HOA board backed her, the lines blurred between justice and politics. The father recognized the tactic. It was the same one insurgents used in villages overseas. Control the story, control the people. And if you control the people, you control the outcome. But there was something Corinne didn't know, something none of them did. This wasn't a man easily silenced. His patience had been forged in desert winds, his discipline tempered in fire. He had spent years learning not to react but to calculate. And while Corinne tried to twist the truth into something small, he was already laying out the battlefield in his mind. That evening he walked the property line, tracing the fence with slow, deliberate steps. The air was heavy with summer heat, cicadas buzzing like distant static. Every detail mattered to him, the angles, the sightlines, the places where shadows fell at dusk. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct. And when his eyes lifted to Corinne's house across the street, he knew something with absolute clarity. She believed she had power. But she had no idea who she was standing against. Inside, his wife watched him through the window. She had seen this look before, years ago before deployments when he was preparing himself for what lay ahead. It terrified her because she knew what it meant. This wasn't just about survival. This was about strategy, about war. And in war, the first rule is simple: know your enemy. So he began to listen. Every word Corinne spoke at HOA meetings, every neighbor she manipulated, every rule she bent to her advantage, it all painted a picture. She had been building control for years, little by little, until she believed the neighborhood itself was hers to command. But power built on fear is fragile. All it takes is one fracture, one moment of resistance, and the entire facade begins to crumble. The fracture had already begun. Neighbors whispered behind her back now. They questioned what really happened that day. They wondered if the HOA board's silence was complicity. And when they saw the father walking his yard with quiet determination, something shifted in their eyes. Respect. Fear, maybe both. Late that night, he sat with his son again. The boy's voice was quiet, almost ashamed, when he asked, "Dad, what if she tries again?" The father's chest tightened, but he forced his voice steady. "Then she'll learn she picked the wrong family." The boy looked at him, searching for reassurance, for some piece of the man he had always believed was unshakable. What he didn't realize was that the man beside him was preparing not just to reassure, but to retaliate in a way Corinne would never see coming. Because sometimes the greatest weapons aren't rifles or bullets. They're patience, they're truth, and when wielded by someone who has spent a lifetime waiting for the right moment, they can be more devastating than any shot ever fired. For now, he waited. He let Corinne believe she was winning. He let the HOA cover her tracks. He let the whispers spread through the neighborhood. Because the longer the silence stretched, the more powerful the reveal would be. And when it came, it wouldn't just clear his son's name. It would destroy hers. The next HOA meeting was supposed to be routine. Budget updates, landscaping complaints, a debate over whether residents could paint their shutters navy blue. But that night, the air in the clubhouse felt heavier, like everyone knew they were standing on the edge of something fragile. The father walked in quietly, his presence alone shifting the mood. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Even Karen, seated at the head of the long table with her stack of neatly arranged papers, faltered for just a second when she saw him. It was the first time they had been in the same room since the shot rang out. No one mentioned it directly. The board avoided eye contact, diving into agenda items with rehearsed cheerfulness. But silence has a way of screaming louder than words. Every neighbor in the room was waiting for it, waiting to see if the father would stand, if he would call her out, if he would unleash the fury they all knew was boiling beneath the surface. But he didn't. Instead, he sat there, arms crossed, eyes steady, saying nothing. And that silence, more than shouting ever could, unnerved her. Karen cleared her throat more than once, adjusted her papers, snapped at a board member who stumbled over a report. Her mask of control was cracking piece by piece under the weight of his calm. Because she didn't know his silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Later that night, neighbors lingered in the parking lot, whispering in hushed voices. "Why didn't he say anything?" one asked. Another shook their head. "That man, he's planning something, you can see it." And they were right. At home, the father sat at the kitchen table, maps of the neighborhood spread before him. It wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. He marked property lines, noted HOA bylaws, traced the boundaries Karen had manipulated for years. Every inch of ink on those pages told a story of abuse, of rules bent to her will, of families who had suffered in silence. He wasn't just going to fight for his son, he was going to dismantle her kingdom, brick by brick. But first, he had to gather allies. The next few weeks, he did something unexpected. Instead of confronting her directly, he listened. He listened to the widow down the street who had been fined for a garden statue too close to her walkway. He listened to the young couple who had been threatened with liens because their mailbox was unapproved. He listened to the single mother who had paid hundreds in fees for nothing more than leaving a stroller on her porch. Every story added weight to the file he was building. And as word spread, something remarkable happened. Neighbors who once avoided him began knocking on his door. They came with envelopes, with receipts, with letters from the board stamped with Karen's signature. One by one, they added fuel to the fire he was quietly building. Meanwhile, Karen grew bolder, convinced his silence meant surrender. She laughed at block parties, waved smugly from her car, and even had the audacity to send a courtesy notice to his family about their unkempt lawn, knowing full well his son was still recovering inside the house. Each paper she dropped in his mailbox only sealed her fate tighter. But here's what she didn't see. He was documenting everything. Every letter, every rule, every manipulated vote, and more importantly, every neighbor willing to testify. The tension finally broke one humid evening when Karen decided to test the waters again. She stood outside, hands on hips, yelling across the street about delinquents who endangered the neighborhood, while her allies on the board nodded nervously. His wife pulled the curtains closed, her hands trembling, whispering, "Don't give her what she wants." But the father stepped outside. The whole street went still. Children froze mid-game. Dogs stopped barking. Even the cicadas seemed to quiet. He walked across the lawn slowly, each step deliberate until he stood only a few feet away from her. And then, with a calmness that cut deeper than rage ever could, he asked, "Do you think power will protect you from the truth?" Her smirk faltered. "You fired at my son," he continued, his voice low, measured, carrying enough weight for every neighbor to hear. "And you think hiding behind bylaws and signatures will erase that. But you don't know me. You don't know what I see, what I hear, what I prepare for. You don't even realize that every time you open your mouth, you hand me another piece of the rope you're hanging yourself with." Her face reddened, her composure slipping as murmurs rippled through the crowd that had gathered. For the first time, Karen looked less like the queen of the neighborhood and more like what she really was, afraid. But the father didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply turned, walked back to his home, and closed the door behind him. And that silence, it was louder than any gunshot. That night, his son asked him quietly, "Dad, why didn't you just tell everyone what she did?" He rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. Because timing is everything, and when the moment comes, no one will doubt who she really is. The boy frowned, trying to understand. But he caught a glimpse in his father's eyes, of a man who had spent his life waiting for seconds, breaths, heartbeats to align before pulling the trigger. Patience wasn't just his strength, it was his weapon. And Karen, she had just stepped into his scope without even realizing it. The next morning, the neighborhood woke to an unusual quiet. No barking dogs, no children racing down the sidewalks. Even the mailman moved cautiously, glancing over his shoulder as if the air itself had grown heavier overnight. Word had traveled fast, something was coming. Everyone could feel it, even if no one knew what. Inside the house, the father was already at work. Maps, photos, letters, and HOA notices littered the dining table. Each page he picked up told a story, proof of Karen's escalating abuse, manipulation, and intimidation. But he wasn't just collecting evidence. He was constructing a strategy, a meticulously detailed plan designed to reveal her for exactly who she was. Every angle, every witness, every rule she had twisted would be used to dismantle her authority. His wife watched him from the kitchen doorway, her hands crossed over her chest. "You're going to ruin her," she whispered, almost afraid to breathe the words. He didn't look up. "I'm not ruining her, I'm revealing her. There's a difference." The boy peeked from the stairs, curiosity and fear mixed in his wide eyes. "Dad, is she going to pay for what she did?" He knelt and fixed the boy with a steady gaze. "She will face the truth, and truth is something no amount of money, manipulation, or HOA power can hide from." By afternoon, neighbors began showing up, quietly slipping notes under his door or handing him envelopes filled with records. A single mother who had been fined hundreds of dollars for a swing set in her yard. A retiree whose garden was labeled unauthorized landscaping. Each story, each complaint, added weight to the father's case. It was no longer just about protecting his son. It had become a mission to reclaim the neighborhood from fear. Meanwhile, Karen continued her public display of authority, unaware of the storm brewing behind the closed doors of the house across the street. She made calls, sent emails, and reminded the HOA board that she was maintaining order. She even held an impromptu meeting on her porch, drawing neighbors in with promises of safety and community values. To anyone watching, she appeared untouchable. But her mask was beginning to slip. The father began reaching out to key witnesses, discreetly ensuring that every account of her behavior would be recorded and verifiable. He wasn't doing this to intimidate. He was doing it to make sure the facts were undeniable. By the time he was done, Karen's version of events would be stripped bare, exposed for what it really was: lies, intimidation, and recklessness. It wasn't just evidence he was gathering, he was building momentum. And momentum, once unleashed, has a way of toppling even the most arrogant of people. That evening, the father took his son to the backyard. The boy still flinched when he saw a shadow, still blinked at sudden noises, but he was slowly learning that his father's calm was more protective than any walls or locks. "Do you see?" the father said, pointing toward the tree lines separating their property from the next. "How every branch, every shadow, every angle can be controlled if you understand it." The boy nodded, slowly beginning to grasp the lesson. "It's like you're always ready." "I am," the father replied. "And sometimes being ready means waiting, watching, and knowing when to act. The best defense is patience. The strongest defense is knowledge." Back inside, the father spread out his notes and began mapping out Karen's every move over the past months. Late fees, warnings, HOA memos, all cataloged in precise order. He traced the incidents back to the first time she had tried to assert control over a neighbor's property, long before the shooting. Patterns emerged. Motives became clear. The picture of a woman intoxicated by power and oblivious to consequences crystallized before his eyes. It was time to make a move. But not yet. Karen would have to continue underestimating him. She would have to feel secure in her position, confident that the HOA would shield her from consequences. Because the moment she realized she was vulnerable, she would adapt, fight back, and the advantage would be lost. Timing, strategy, patience, these were the tools of his craft. The first step came subtly. Flyers appeared under doors, not accusatory but neutral in tone, reminding residents of HOA bylaws, safety protocols, and community standards. Each flyer highlighted rules Karen had selectively enforced, illustrating inconsistencies without pointing fingers. Neighbors began talking, questions arose, whispers grew louder, and for the first time Karen sensed tension, though she didn't know why. That night the father gathered the family in the living room. His son, still pale from the graze, leaned against him. His wife sat beside him, anxious yet trusting. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't scold or threaten. He simply laid out the plan piece by piece, emphasizing one core truth: they would not be intimidated. "Karen believes she's untouchable," he said quietly. "But untouchable doesn't mean invincible, and power built on fear doesn't last forever." His son listened, awe and hope flickering in his eyes. "Will she come after us again?" The father shook his head. "Not if we stay ready, not if we let the facts speak louder than her lies." In the quiet hours before dawn, he returned to his maps, letters, and evidence, reviewing every detail with precision. Each notation, each connection strengthened his confidence. He knew the day would come when Karen would face the weight of her actions. He didn't need to rush it. All he needed was patience, preparation, and the right moment. And deep down, he knew that when that moment arrived, it wouldn't just be a victory for his family. It would be a turning point for the entire neighborhood. Because sometimes, the most dangerous people aren't the ones with weapons. They're the ones who understand timing, strategy, and patience. And Karen, she had just unknowingly stepped into the orbit of someone who possessed all three. The day the first letters went out, the neighborhood woke to a shift in the air. Envelopes tucked under doormats, slid under doors, and left on stoops carried questions, not accusations. Rules, regulations, facts. And every fact pointed toward one undeniable truth: Karen had been bending power to suit herself for far too long. At first she laughed. "Some prank, no doubt," she said to a few of her HOA allies, waving a hand dismissively. But the father had already anticipated her reaction. He knew she would scoff, and he knew she would underestimate the ripple these small actions would cause. Because the real force wasn't in shouting or threatening, it was in letting the evidence speak for itself. Neighbors began talking, quietly at first in hushed tones over fences and across driveways, then louder, questions spread like wildfire. "Have you seen these?" one whispered, holding up a flyer. Another shook her head. "All of these, and she still claims she's fair?" The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the father could feel it. Karen's aura of invincibility was cracking. He didn't stop there. Over the next week, he held one-on-one conversations with residents who had suffered under her rule. Each story was a thread, and together they were weaving a tapestry of undeniable truth. He didn't lecture, he didn't rage, he listened. He recorded. He cataloged every detail. Every injustice, every lie, every intimidation tactic became a weapon of its own, a weapon he wielded with meticulous precision. Karen, meanwhile, continued her performance. She hosted meetings with forced cheerfulness, smiled at block parties, and waved at families walking by. But the tension was there. The subtle glances, the quiet mutters behind her back, the way neighbors hesitated before answering her questions, she noticed it, even if she didn't fully understand. The first cracks in her armor were appearing, and she was powerless to stop them. The father waited. Patience was everything. He knew that if he revealed too much too soon, she would adapt, cover her tracks, and silence the truth again. Timing was crucial. Every move had to be calculated, deliberate, and precise, just like the missions he had once executed as a sniper. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he called a neighborhood meeting. Not in the clubhouse, not in a public space, but in his own backyard, quietly, with only those willing to hear the truth. They gathered, curious, cautious. The father didn't raise his voice. He didn't make grand declarations. He simply laid out the facts, one by one, letting the documentation and witnesses speak for themselves. The effect was immediate. Faces shifted. Whispers turned into murmurs. Some neighbors nodded in recognition, others in disbelief. And through it all, Karen remained oblivious. She wasn't in the room. She didn't know the tide had begun to turn. The father's son watched from the sidelines, a mix of awe and pride in his eyes. For the first time since the shooting, he felt safe, not just physically, but morally. His father wasn't just protecting him, he was standing for truth, for justice, for the integrity of the entire neighborhood. And Karen, still confident in her untouchability, had no idea that her empire was crumbling from the inside out. Within days, the HOA board received the first official complaints, supported by verifiable evidence and first-hand accounts. Meetings were postponed. Notices were issued. Members who had once sided with Karen began questioning her authority. The network of fear she had built over the years was unraveling, and all the while the father remained calm, observing every reaction, measuring every step. Then came the moment he had been waiting for, the subtle but unmistakable misstep. Karen, growing frustrated at the slow pace of her control, made a public statement dismissing one of the complaints. She called it malicious gossip, attempting to protect herself while undermining the truth. That was the opening he had been waiting for. He responded not with anger, not with accusation, but with the undeniable proof she had inadvertently handed him. Records, witness statements, copies of her own memos, a timeline that left no room for doubt. The HOA board could no longer ignore it. Neighbors who had feared retaliation now stood together, confident in the facts and the father's leadership. The first real confrontation came quietly in a small conference room. Karen tried to assert her authority, but the father remained composed. Calm, steady, unyielding. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't threaten. He simply laid the truth bare, and for the first time, Karen realized that the power she had wielded for so long was gone. The room was no longer hers. Every lie, every intimidation tactic, every false claim had been exposed. The father's son, standing beside him, felt something shift inside. He had been the target of violence, the bearer of fear, but now he understood strength. Strength wasn't about the ability to strike. It was about patience, preparation, and the courage to do what was right when it mattered most. Outside, the neighborhood felt it too. Conversations changed. Smiles returned where there had been anxiety. And though Karen had not yet faced the final consequences, the knowledge that her control was broken spread like sunlight through the cul-de-sac. That night the father and his son sat on the porch, the air cool and still. "You see," he said quietly, "sometimes the battle isn't in the shouting, the anger, or even the guns. Sometimes the battle is in preparation, patience, and truth. And when you use those well, the enemy doesn't stand a chance." His son nodded, finally understanding. "So she's done." The father shook his head. "Not yet, but she will be. Soon, everyone will see exactly who she really is." And in that moment, a sense of calm settled over the family. Not the calm of victory, but the calm of inevitability. Karen's reckoning was coming. And when it did, it wouldn't just be a lesson for her. It would be a warning for anyone who ever thought they could wield fear as power. Because the most dangerous person isn't always the one with the weapon. Sometimes, it's the one who waits, observes, and strikes with precision when the time is right. Karen had no idea that the sniper's patience wasn't just on the battlefield anymore. It was now in her neighborhood. Karen's confidence had always been her armor. That smug smile, the carefully clipped words at every HOA meeting, the way she strutted across the neighborhood like she owned every mailbox and driveway. But now the first cracks had appeared, and she was desperate to patch them before anyone noticed. She called an emergency HOA meeting, summoning her allies and issuing threats veiled as requests for clarification. The room was tense, filled with residents who were no longer certain which side they should be on. Whispers of the father's evidence had spread, and although Karen tried to maintain control, every glance from neighbors chipped away at her facade. The father didn't attend. He had already decided that showing up would play into her hands, that confrontation in the wrong environment could allow her to manipulate the narrative again. Instead, he watched from a distance, observing reactions, listening to tones, noting the subtle panic creeping into her voice. This was his field of operation now, not rooftops and desert sands, but lawns and HOA bylaws. The letters, testimonies, and records he had compiled were working faster than he anticipated. Board members who had once nodded at Karen's every whim now questioned her motives openly. Her carefully constructed story began unraveling with every why and how that was asked in that crowded room. By midweek, she was already flailing. A report about the shooting had reached local authorities, not because he had involved them, but because a neighbor finally had the courage to speak the truth. Karen panicked. Emails she had hoped would intimidate residents were met with silence. Calls intended to manipulate were ignored. And when she tried to send a message directly to the father, she found his number disconnected. Or rather, redirected to voicemail, which contained only a calm, recorded message. Facts speak louder than fear. For Karen, it was infuriating. She had always relied on intimidation, on the quiet fear she cultivated in others. Now, she realized fear alone could not protect her, not against someone who had faced far more dangerous enemies and had survived, not against someone who had learned the art of patience and strategy under fire. At home, the father's son watched the changes with growing admiration. He saw the transformation not just in Karen's behavior, but in the neighborhood itself. Families who had been silenced, fearful of retaliation, were now speaking up. Conversations that had once been whispered behind fences were now happening openly, and the father's calm, deliberate influence had given people courage they had lost long ago. One evening, the father called his son over to the table. Spread before them were diagrams, timelines, and statements. "Look at this," he said, tracing the sequence of Karen's manipulations over the past year. "Every rule she twisted, every complaint she ignored, every threat she made, it's all here, and soon everyone will see it." The boy leaned in, wide-eyed, realizing for the first time the depth of his father's skill. Not skill with a rifle, but skill with patience, observation, and strategy. The same traits that had once made him one of the deadliest snipers in the military. Outside, Karen paced her porch. She had begun to sense the shift but didn't yet understand the source. The neighborhood had grown quieter, the laughter of children more cautious. Her usual allies were uneasy, and even the HOA board's staunchest supporters were hesitant. Something was happening beyond her control, and she could feel it in her chest like a slow-burning fire. The father, observing from his window, noted every move, every hesitation, every forced smile. Each sign of panic was a data point, each misstep a confirmation that his plan was unfolding as intended. He didn't need to act yet. He simply needed to wait, let her make the mistakes, and then use them to dismantle her authority completely. The turning point came that Friday evening. A neighbor who had been previously intimidated finally approached the father with a detailed account of Karen's threats, complete with emails, recordings, and photos. It was the missing piece that tied everything together, the undeniable proof of her abuse of power. He reviewed it carefully, noting the patterns, the lies, the manipulations. Then he smiled. It wasn't a smile of malice. It was a smile of inevitability. He knew that the time for subtlety was ending. Soon, Karen's carefully cultivated persona would collapse under the weight of facts. The neighborhood would finally see her for what she was, a woman who had let fear rule her actions, and a family who had turned patience and truth into the ultimate weapon. That night he sat with his son on the porch again, the air thick with anticipation. "Do you understand now?" he asked quietly. "Strength isn't about anger or shouting. Strength is patience, observation, and knowing the exact moment to act." The boy nodded, a mixture of pride and understanding washing over him. "So all this is happening because you waited." "Yes," the father replied, "because timing makes all the difference. And now we wait just a little longer. Karen doesn't realize how fragile her empire has become. She's walking blind, and soon everyone will see the truth." Meanwhile, Karen's panic was growing. She sent frantic messages to board members, called neighbors in attempts to sway their loyalty, even held a midnight meeting with a few desperate allies. But every effort was too late. The father's network, built on patience and truth, was already unshakable. She was losing control by the second, and the walls she had built around herself were crumbling. By dawn, the neighborhood was abuzz with hushed excitement. Conversations that had once been dominated by fear were now filled with speculation and hope. Residents who had suffered in silence were emboldened, and Karen's influence, once absolute, had diminished visibly. And the father, he remained calm, watching it all unfold, knowing that the final act was near. Because sometimes the most dangerous battles are not fought with bullets. They're fought with patience, strategy, and an unyielding commitment to truth. Karen had no idea that her reckoning was not only imminent, but unstoppable. The day Karen finally realized she had lost control was the day the neighborhood stopped pretending. The subtle whispers became open conversation. The cautious glances transformed into direct questions. Families who had once cowered under her authority now approached the HOA board with evidence she could no longer deny. And all the while, she watched, powerless, unable to turn back time or reclaim the loyalty she had once commanded. It began with a notice posted on the HOA bulletin board. Nothing dramatic, nothing inflammatory, just a clear factual recounting of complaints, fines, and incidents, each supported by documents and testimony. Residents gathered, reading each line, some shaking their heads, others nodding grimly. The pieces of the puzzle that had been hidden for years were finally visible. And as they read, the story of Karen's manipulation, her lies, and her reckless behavior became undeniable. Karen stormed into the scene, her usual air of superiority replaced by desperation. "This isn't fair," she shouted, waving her hands at the crowd. "These are lies. You can't believe everything you hear." But no one flinched. Neighbors stared at her, their expressions firm, their voices steady. "We don't need to believe," one neighbor said calmly. "We have the evidence." Her eyes darted around the room, looking for allies, but most of the HOA board members avoided her gaze. A few of her staunchest supporters had quietly removed themselves from the situation, unwilling to be associated with the collapse of her authority. Karen's panic grew with each passing second, her control slipping further from her grasp. Meanwhile, the father stood at the edge of the crowd, silent, composed, observing every reaction. He didn't need to speak. The evidence he had spent weeks collecting, every letter, email, testimony, and photo, was doing the work for him. The neighborhood was no longer under Karen's shadow. The truth had illuminated everything. One brave resident stepped forward, recounting their experience with Karen's intimidation. The room listened, captivated, and soon others followed. Stories poured out, families intimidated, fines levied unfairly, threats whispered in the dead of night. Each narrative added weight to the undeniable truth. Karen's reign of fear was over. The father's son, standing beside him, felt a surge of relief and pride. The fear that had once gripped him, the uncertainty that had haunted every step outside their home, was lifting. He watched as his father's calm authority replaced the chaos that Karen had sown. It wasn't just a lesson in courage. It was a lesson in justice, in patience, in the quiet power of preparation. Karen's face turned pale. She realized in that moment that no amount of shouting or pleading could restore the control she had lost. The web of manipulation she had spun for years was unraveling faster than she could comprehend. And for the first time, she felt truly vulnerable. The father finally spoke, his voice steady, carrying across the room. "This neighborhood deserves honesty, it deserves fairness, and it deserves safety for our children and families. We've waited patiently. We've documented every action, every misstep, and now the truth stands before us." A hush fell over the room. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but the weight of facts, witnesses, and evidence was too great. Her usual tactics, intimidation, charm, deflection, failed. She was exposed, cornered by the very system she had once used to her advantage. The HOA board, realizing they could no longer defend her, began a formal review of her actions. The neighborhood watched, united, as accountability replaced fear. Karen's influence, once absolute, crumbled under the pressure of undeniable truth and collective courage. Outside, the father's son looked up at him, eyes wide. "Is it over?" he asked softly. The father nodded, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's not just over. Justice has been served, and sometimes the strongest victories come not from anger or force, but from patience, planning, and unwavering commitment to what's right." The crowd dispersed slowly, conversations filled with relief, pride, and newfound hope. The father stayed behind a moment longer, ensuring that Karen's power was truly broken, that her presence no longer carried the same weight it once had. He knew the neighborhood had reclaimed its voice, and with it, its freedom. That night, as the father tucked his son into bed, he reflected on the journey. The fear, the uncertainty, the tension, they had all led to this moment of triumph. And while Karen would eventually face the consequences formally, the real victory was already complete. The neighborhood had awakened, the truth had prevailed, and his family had survived unbroken. The father sat quietly for a moment longer, looking out the window at the houses bathed in soft streetlight. He thought about how easily fear could control people, how powerful patience and preparation could be when combined with truth. And he felt a quiet pride, not in the confrontation itself, but in the resilience, courage, and moral clarity that had guided every step of their fight. Karen had been a test, a challenge to their safety, their courage, and their integrity. And through it all, the father had shown his son and the neighborhood what true strength looked like: calm, deliberate, unwavering, and guided by justice. The boy, finally able to breathe without fear, drifted into sleep, safe in the knowledge that he was protected not just by his father's skill, but by the careful, patient strategy that had ensured the neighborhood could no longer be ruled by intimidation. The story wasn't just about defeating Karen. It was about the power of patience, the inevitability of truth, and the courage required to stand when others falter. And the father, silent and steady, knew that this lesson, learned in the shadows of fear and danger, would resonate far beyond their quiet cul-de-sac. The neighborhood was quiet that morning, but it wasn't the quiet of fear. It was the calm that follows a storm, the stillness after the chaos has passed, and the weight of justice has settled. Karen's once commanding presence had vanished like a shadow retreating before sunlight. Word spread quickly. She was facing formal consequences, her authority stripped, her manipulations laid bare for all to see. The father stood on the porch, surveying the street. Neighbors waved, smiled, and exchanged knowing glances. Families were talking openly again, children played freely, and for the first time in months, the neighborhood felt safe. Every step, every whisper, every subtle act of intimidation that Karen had used for years had been undone, not by anger, but by patience, strategy, and truth. Inside the house, his son came running, backpack still slung over one shoulder, excitement in his eyes. "Dad, everyone is talking about what happened. They're saying you made it all right." The father smiled, kneeling to meet his son at eye level. "We didn't do it alone. We waited, we watched, and we let truth do its work. That's all it took." "But you didn't even yell at her," the boy said, astonished. "You just planned it." The father nodded. Anger can destroy, patience builds. Waiting for the right moment, letting facts speak louder than fear, that's the strongest power there is. Outside, Karen packed her things, moving with hurried frustration, trying to salvage the remnants of a life built on manipulation. But it was too late. The network of neighbors, armed not with weapons but with truth and courage, had reclaimed their community. And the father, watching silently, knew that her reign was over forever. The HOA board called an emergency session to formalize the consequences. Karen, once confident and commanding, arrived visibly shaken. She tried to project control, tried to assert authority one last time, but her words fell flat. Evidence, witnesses, and the unified neighborhood had already rendered her powerless. Every threat she had ever issued was documented, every manipulation recorded. The board had no choice but to act, and act decisively. When the decision was announced, Karen removed from all positions, fines and penalties enforced, her reputation irreparably tarnished, the room exhaled collectively. Relief, satisfaction, and awe mingled in the air. Families who had been intimidated for years finally felt vindicated. And the father's son, standing beside him, understood the weight of what had just occurred. Justice, patience, and strategy had won over fear and cruelty. That evening, the father sat with his family in the living room, reflecting on the events. His wife rested her head against his shoulder, exhausted but relieved. His son leaned against him, a newfound confidence in his posture. Together, they were safe, not just from Karen's threats, but from the shadow of fear she had cast over their lives. "Do you think she'll ever understand what she did?" his son asked softly. The father shook his head, thoughtful. "Some people never do, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that truth was shown, courage prevailed, and the neighborhood can finally move forward." And forward they did. Gardens were restored. Children laughed openly. Families organized block parties, celebrating their regained freedom. The father watched quietly, proud not because he had defeated Karen, but because he had helped restore dignity, safety, and trust to a community that had forgotten it existed. The lesson was clear, not just for the neighborhood, but for his son, for himself, and for anyone watching. Power gained through fear is temporary. Control achieved through intimidation collapses under the weight of truth. And patience, steady, deliberate, unwavering patience, is sometimes the deadliest and most effective weapon of all. Weeks later, as the neighborhood settled into its renewed rhythm, the father reflected on the journey. He thought about the fear, the tension, the quiet dread that had once gripped every street and yard. He thought about the small victories that had seemed insignificant at the time but ultimately built into an unstoppable wave of justice. And he thought about his son, who now understood the true meaning of courage, not in fighting, but in standing firm, watching, and waiting for the right moment to act. Corinne's fate was sealed. Legal consequences followed. Her authority evaporated, and the neighborhood, once fractured by fear, was whole again, bonded not just by proximity, but by shared experience, courage, and the restoration of fairness. The father knew one thing clearly. This story would not just be a lesson in neighborhood politics. It was a lesson in life itself. Strength is measured not by how loudly you can shout, but by how patiently you can endure, how deliberately you can act, and how firmly you can stand by truth when others cower. That night, the father's son went to bed without fear for the first time. The memory of the shot, the panic, and the uncertainty that had haunted him began to fade. What remained was confidence, pride, and understanding, the knowledge that his father had not only protected him, but had taught him a lesson that would last a lifetime. And the father, looking out over the quiet, safe neighborhood, smiled quietly to himself. The battle was over. Corinne's shadow was gone. And the real victory, the one that mattered most, was the restoration of justice, courage, and dignity to every family in their community. Sometimes, he thought, the strongest victories are not won with force, but with patience, strategy, and unwavering faith in what is right. And in that quiet, peaceful night, he knew that his family, his neighborhood, and his son had all emerged stronger, safer, and wiser than before. Because in the end, truth cannot be silenced, courage cannot be intimidated, and the right person with the right patience will always prevail. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one.